I hate to say it over and over again, but the regulatory landscape keeps incrementally tipping against the architecture of Ethereum proof of stake and in favor of Cardano proof of stake. Today, the SEC charged Kraken with securities violations related to its offering of staking services. The SEC press release on those charges makes it clear that their concern is around the investors losing control of their tokens and taking on risk. They also described the arrangement as an offering of investment contracts in exchange for investor tokens. This is all fine for Cardano because none of those things seem to take place in Cardano proof of stake. But Ethereum maximalists seem to be sweating bullets today because what the SEC is describing is very hard to distinguish from a lot of regular things in the Ethereum proof of stake world. Ready? Let's go. Today, we are going to discuss these SEC charges against Kraken for its staking services and everything that might mean, why Ethereum people seem to be so worried about this, and Cardano people seem to just be kind of chilling, the reaction from Charles, and even who might be getting letters from the SEC next. If you feel like this guy might have made some mistakes by wearing 2 watches but not wearing more comfortable running pants, or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. This is the SEC press release on the Kraken charges. So the SEC charges against Kraken have to do with their crypto asset staking services, which the SEC is going to like to call staking as a service. So they think they have some kind of definition for this staking as a service thing. And of course, it's going to be a very ambiguous definition, sort of in their favor, so that later on they can apply that term to whatever they want. You know what I mean? They don't tell you like staking as a service is this. Except that they kind of do, and it's good for Cardano. So when we go through this, we've got the staking as a service term, and they say things like this. Staking is a process in which investors lock up or stake their crypto tokens with a blockchain validator. So you notice they used that lockup terminology. It's really obvious they're thinking of something like the Ethereum type of staking, where you have to lock up your assets so that the Ethereum proof of stake system can slash them if they want to. It's very obvious they're talking about that because this is something that doesn't happen in Cardano. You don't lock up your tokens when you're staking in Cardano. They also say when investors provide tokens to staking as a service providers, they lose control of those tokens and take on risks associated with those platforms. So you notice they don't really define staking as a service, but they do say, but if it is staking as a service, here's one of the things that happens. You lose control of those tokens and take on risks associated with those platforms with very little protection. So you notice, even in the case where you're not self-staking in the Cardano ecosystem, delegation doesn't look like this either. Staking doesn't look like this language up here, this earlier language, and delegation doesn't look like this language down here, because in Cardano and delegation, you don't lose control of your tokens. You retain custody of your tokens in Cardano. So here's the kind of built-in ambiguity that's probably driving a lot of Ethereum maximalists crazy today. They say when investors provide tokens to staking as a service providers, they lose control of those tokens and take on risks associated with those platforms with very little protection. Here's the problem. It's very hard to distinguish this from regular Ethereum delegation. Investors provide tokens to a stake pool. They lose control of those tokens. They have to lose control of those tokens because how else could they be slashed? If they had control of the tokens, they couldn't be slashed. You have to lose control of the tokens so that the system can slash them. and they take on risks associated with those platforms slashing with very little protection. They have no protection from the slashing. The whole point of Ethereum staking is that your assets can be slashed. So there's something at stake, in the words of a lot of Ethereum people. They criticize a blockchain like Cardano because they say there's nothing at stake. But the whole point of the something at stake in the Ethereum system is that you don't have control of your tokens. There is a risk of slashing, and you don't really have protection against that slashing. There's no way for you to prevent the slashing if it's going to happen. Down here below, they also say whether it's through staking as a service, lending, or other means, crypto intermediaries, when offering investment contracts in exchange for investors' tokens, need to provide the proper disclosures and safeguards required by our securities laws. Again, here we have some pretty ambiguous terminology. Crypto intermediaries. Are those Ethereum stake pools? Because they say whether it's through staking as a service, lending, other means, crypto intermediaries, so other means could be regular Ethereum staking. Crypto intermediaries, which could be regular Ethereum stake pools, when offering investment contracts in exchange for investors' tokens. You notice Cardano seems to not fit this language either, because people aren't giving their tokens to a Cardano stake pool. They keep custody of their tokens. But in Ethereum, you must give up custody of your tokens. And the thing you get in exchange, I mean, a lot of Ethereum people out there have their fingers crossed right now that the SEC doesn't ever say that that's an investment contract that the Ethereum stake pool is giving in exchange for investors' tokens. You can see a lot of this language hinges on custody. It doesn't hinge on the fact that Kraken is a centralized exchange. It hinges on the loss of custody of the investors' tokens. When investors provide tokens, whereby investors transfer crypto assets, when offering investment contracts in exchange for investors' tokens, every time they talk about what's going on, they talk about the loss of custody, which is something you must have in Ethereum staking, but you do not have in Cardano staking. Of course, Gary Gensler doesn't miss a chance to make a whole video with sort of graphics and everything if there's any kind of a high profile release of charges from the SEC. So he made this video where he just kind of reiterates the same things. He tells you that staking is when investors lock up their tokens in escrow and help validate the next block of data. Notice again, his concept, and he doesn't say like staking in a certain blockchain. He just says like staking generally. This is what it is. Investors lock up their tokens in escrow. And again, that completely doesn't describe what happens in Cardano. When he's thinking of staking, he's not thinking about what happens in Cardano, but he is talking about what happens in Ethereum. Then he goes on to say, hey, staking, can be complicated and it takes a large amount of tokens up front. So instead, you might go to a staking as a service provider. Notice he doesn't make a any kind of a distinction between staking and delegating. He just says there's this thing staking, and then there's using a staking as a service provider. What he's leaving out there is delegating. There's this ambiguity built into that, where later on he could say that something like an Ethereum stake pool is a staking as a service provider. Because a stake pool, I think we can say a stake pool is they're providing a service. They're not providing you with a good. So they're definitely providing you with a service, and that service is staking. He's making it very palatable, because when he says staking as a service provider, you're thinking about Kraken and Coinbase and Binance. And if you're a normal crypto person, you're like, this is great. They hurt our Nakamoto coefficient. Pretty much regardless of what ecosystem you're in, they centralize our ecosystem. So good riddance to these staking as a service providers. But what you're not thinking about is that the SEC could come back later and say that something like an Ethereum stake pool is a staking as a service provider. Because look at how he describes it. We already talked about how an Ethereum stake pool or a stake pool generally is providing you with a service, not a good, that is staking. So it fits the common sense, meaning of those terms. But then look at how he describes it. He says, when you send your coins to them, they take control, possibly pooling your tokens with thousands or millions of others while promoting returns. So you notice this too sort of fits the scenario of Ethereum delegation, but it doesn't fit Cardano delegation, because in Cardano delegation, you don't send your tokens to the stake pool, and the stake pool doesn't take your tokens and pool them with thousands or millions of others, because we never take custody of your coins. This is a really important distinction. Everything he says, there's ambiguity packed in there that is very hard to distinguish, makes the language very hard to distinguish from normal Ethereum delegation. But it's completely distinguishable from Cardano delegation. It doesn't fit Cardano delegation, but it does fit Ethereum delegation. And you could argue that with the liquid staking in Ethereum, like Lido, it might fit that even better. Because with Lido, you've got a very similar fact pattern in that you're giving up your tokens, and there's this promise of returns in the staking. It fits all the same things as the Kraken language we looked at, except you've got this added risk. There's all the loss of custody and the risk, just like with Kraken, but you've got this added risk because Lido is giving you this derivative instrument, the liquid version of your delegated ether. They're giving you staked ETH, and your staked ETH has a bunch of additional risks associated with it. We know that because in the Lido white paper, and now, which was previously on their website, and now in the Lido FAQs, they lay out those risks. There's like 7 risks, if I'm remembering correctly, and 2 of them had to do with the beacon chain. I might have the numbers wrong, but I think it was like 2 or 3 of them had to do with the beacon chain, and the rest of them had to do with basically using Lido generally, and those still apply. So I could easily imagine a regulator like the SEC coming along and saying, hey, this whole Lido thing, it looks like there are even additional risks beyond what people might have encountered with something like Kraken staking as a service. This looks like staking as a service to us, but then there's additional risks because you've got this derivative instrument you're issuing to people in exchange for their assets. We think this is even more risk. Then he goes on to say, it doesn't matter, what the platform is calling it, whether they call it rewards, lending, APY, earn, or just staking. That relationship should come with the protections of federal securities law. So he's basically saying, hey, we're thinking of all these things as the same, whether it's a lending platform, some CeFi platform that's telling you you're lending your assets, whether it's, something like Coinbase Earn, if it's some centralized exchange telling you it's an earn program, or if they're offering, some kind of annual yield, or even if it's just called staking. Why would he include that word staking without saying, what we mean is staking on a centralized platform or staking on a centralized exchange? They could have easily said, hey, when we're talking about staking as a service providers, we're talking about centralized platforms, but they don't say that. They just say, hey, it might be called just staking. And we're kind of thinking of all these things as being equivalent, even just plain staking. They don't say staking with a centralized exchange. They just say staking might be the same thing. We're thinking of those as being the same. Hilariously, in the replies to the SEC's posting of this video, you can see 3 Cardano people in a row, at least the way these comments stack up for me in Twitter. You see 3 comments in a row from Cardano people saying, this is surprisingly fair. I also think that this time Gary is right, or this validates the Cardano staking consensus mechanism. All the Cardano people are totally cool with this because they can tell when they see that language, it doesn't really apply to Cardano. The things he's saying are aimed squarely at the Ethereum proof of stake system and don't really seem to apply to Cardano staking. But then we get to the first comment from someone who I would say is a media channel that is deeply involved with Ethereum, and their response looks like this. Why are you restricting opportunities for US citizens, Gary? You're preventing crypto wealth from staying inside the US. Kraken FX has been serving US customers for 12 years now. Now capital will go to sketchy offshore platforms like it did with FTX. This is a very different reaction. And among these posters here, you've got Cardano stake pool operators. Here you have a deeply, I would call them a deeply committed Ethereum media channel, and you get nothing but outrage. They're very unhappy with what's happening. And I don't think it's necessarily really what they're saying here. I'm sure that's part of it, but also it's just that when you listen to Gary Gensler say these things, you can tell it's hard to explain why this doesn't all apply to Ethereum, but it's very difficult to explain how this language applies to Cardano. It's not like this is very hidden or obscured. Even last night, before all this came out from the SEC about Kraken, you had Charles Hoskinson being asked to respond to Brian Armstrong's original comment. You'll remember from yesterday's video, we covered this. Brian Armstrong said, "We're hearing rumors that the SEC would like to get rid of crypto staking in the US for retail customers." I would guess that Brian Armstrong already knew about these Kraken charges. Obviously, the people at Kraken did because it was settled. There's already been a settlement between the SEC and Kraken. So Kraken obviously knew, and I'm guessing that Brian Armstrong found out somehow, probably through Kraken. People at Kraken probably told him. I'm guessing. I don't have any reason to say that, any basis for that, but I'm just guessing that, he knew about this beforehand. So Charles was asked to comment on what Brian Armstrong said, and here was his comment. He said, "Ethereum staking is problematic. Temporarily giving up your assets to someone else to have them get a return looks a lot like regulated products. Slashing in bonds, not so good. Non-custodial liquid staking, on the other hand, is like the mining pools we've used for 13 years. And I think he's absolutely right. This is what we talked about in the video yesterday. When you transfer your assets to somebody else, when you give your assets to somebody else, and you do that with the expectation of them bringing you a return, it looks a lot like a regulated financial product. It sounds like you're giving me a fact pattern that can be easily matched to the requirements of the Howey test. And then you've got the slashing on top of that in Ethereum. There is a lot of risk. And you notice in the SEC's press release and in Gary Gensler's video, it seemed like their big focus was on the risk to the investors. How much more risk could you have than the assets just being deleted by the protocol? Charles said, "We thought a lot about what makes sense for a sustainable proof of stake protocol that promotes control by the many instead of the few and creates a large decentralized environment. Locking funds, encouraging centralization, and poor protocol design hurts the whole industry. It's sad that all proof of stake protocols might get lumped together due to a fundamental misunderstanding about the actual facts of operation and design. It's like comparing 3 Mile Island to a modern 4th generation nuclear reactor because they both use the word fission." I think Charles is right. Of course he's concerned because even Brian Armstrong, who is very much a part of the crypto world, is a very large figure in the crypto world as the head of Coinbase, he didn't say the SEC would like to get rid of staking as a service or, custodial crypto staking. He just said the SEC would like to get rid of crypto staking in the US. But Charles is right. There's always a possibility that a very bureaucratic organization like the SEC that seems to be so different in its perspective on what's good for crypto, what's good for the American investor, what policy should prevail. They're so different in their perspective on crypto than us who are actually in crypto. It's always possible that somehow the SEC gets around to just throwing the book at all of crypto, regardless of whether or not there's any change in custody. That could always happen. Luckily, Charles and IOG seem to always have contingency plans on contingency plans. And Charles dropped a whole video today addressing the entire situation and even that worst case scenario. Let's say the SEC and the courts, somehow, they don't even take into account that there's no transfer of custody in the Cardano staking system. Very worst scenario, and just all of staking gets lumped into this thing. IOG's already got a plan for this. Charles has already got a plan for this. He's got this idea about contingent staking. Right now, delegation is just a push thing. Any delegator can delegate to any pool, and the pool can't do anything about that. It can't demand any information from the delegators. The delegation just shows up, and the stake pool can't do anything about it. And they can't demand any information that might be required for things like KYC, AML, or even to determine if you're a US citizen or a US resident. But if you had contingent staking, where it's kind of a multi-sig thing almost, where you have to consent to your delegation going to a stake pool, and the stake pool has to consent to receiving the delegation. If that kind of system were put in place, and this is something that IOG has thought about, apparently as a kind of contingency plan, if that kind of system were put into place, then a stake pool could say, hey, we're aware the SEC is lumping all of staking in together, and we're just not going to accept delegation from any US residents. Obviously, we're talking about a worst case scenario here, one that I believe, and I think most people in crypto believe, would just drive crypto innovation offshore, and all of the crypto staking would just go offshore. It would be a terrible result for the US. So nobody's saying this is a good idea, but it is reassuring to know that Charles and IOG always seem to have these plan Bs on top of plan Bs. Finally, you'll remember this account from yesterday. This was the account that basically described what was going to happen today, but kind of got the centralized exchange wrong. They described what happened to Kraken today, but identified Coinbase. So they did kind of get it half right. So it's worth looking at this new rumor they surfaced today. They said, update, additional actions are coming from the SEC. Their source apparently says exchanges and stablecoin issuers will be getting Wells notices in the coming days and weeks, and specifically mentioned were Circle and Paxos. This is interesting because obviously Circle is the issuer of USDC, and they said exchanges and stablecoin issuers. And of course, Coinbase has been, I'll use the phrase, heavily intertwined with USDC. Down here, they give you an explanation of what a Wells notice actually is. They say a Wells notice is a notification issued by regulators to inform individuals or companies of completed investigations. So the investigation's already complete, and they send you a letter explaining where infractions have been discovered. It usually takes the form of a letter, which notifies recipients both of the broad nature of the violations uncovered, as well as the nature of the enforcement proceedings to be initiated against the recipient. So by the time these things sort of get to this stage, we saw with the Kraken charges today that were already settled, this part has already happened, and they've had a negotiation, and they've decided what the settlement would be. So if certain companies, if these exchanges and stablecoin issuers were going to be getting these Wells notices in the coming days or weeks, it would be at some point down the road that we would either see settlements or we would see them fighting those charges. Okay, are you ready to get into some wild territory? Let's get into some wild, baseless speculation. And I don't think I need to say that I'm not presenting any of this as a statement of fact. There's been a lot of opinion in this video, like always, but I'm not presenting anything as fact. I'm just presenting some opinions. And the following I would put in the category of probably baseless speculation. This is someone else posting something. It's a prediction about the future. There may be some kernel of truth to it. There may totally not be, but it's kind of interesting. So if you go to the comments below these posts, if you go all the way down here, you're going to find this small account. This is a 517 follower account, so not a big account at all, but they retweeted something that they originally posted on January 18th, looks like. They say, if you thought proof of stake wasn't censorship resistant before, then you're going to find out soon enough. Expect USDC to make some announcements soon, and an internal war amidst ETH users who want to slash. Wouldn't doubt if we see a fork by year's end. So again, I'm not saying this is going to happen at all. I'm saying someone presented this interesting prediction about something that could happen. So obviously Circle is the issuer of USDC. And if that previous rumor is true, maybe Circle will get a Wells notice about USDC. And that could be from anybody. It wouldn't necessarily have to be the SEC. It might be some federal regulator who's more concerned about something like money laundering, right? And that type of regulator might come to an issuer like Circle and say, hey, you guys are doing, a lot of stuff with this giant stablecoin USDC. We think there's a lot of money laundering going on. We would like you to gather KYC information about the clients. You're the issuer. People are using your stablecoin, we think, for money laundering. We want you to KYC everybody. What is Circle going to do? Are they going to throw their hands up and say, we're not doing it? They can't really do that. They're going to have to figure out some way to comply, probably. And if Circle has to comply, a lot of USDC, no pun intended, circulates in the Ethereum ecosystem. You could imagine, what might happen with, validators or middleware providers or various infrastructure providers inside Ethereum who also comply with this. Because even previously, when we saw some infrastructure providers saying they were going to censor certain types of transactions, there was discussion in the community about social slashing. They didn't want to put up with any censorship of the chain whatsoever. So it's not like this is completely impossible. Something like this actually could happen. I'm not saying it's going to happen or even that it's likely to happen, but something like this could actually happen. I hope you had a great week. I hope you're getting ready for a fun weekend, and I'll talk to you soon.